Good evening, everyone. We're going to allow just a couple more minutes to allow people to come in. We have about 10 attendees and about 24 registered. So again, give people a chance to trickle in for about 5 more minutes. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome. This is the Infill Residential Development Ordinance Neighborhood Discussion number 2 for the following neighborhoods. If you are here to hear about this ordinance and you aren't necessarily here to hear about it in relation to these neighborhoods, know that the focus of today's conversation will be on these neighborhoods. And so any questions directed to a specific neighborhood, if we've already discussed them in our first meeting, you can go to that YouTube video and watch to hear more specific information to those neighborhoods. And if they are on our upcoming meetings, you'll want to return again to hear about that particular neighborhood. If you're just here for information's sake, you'll still have a chance to ask questions throughout like everyone else, but know that the focus of today's meeting is in relation to the listed neighborhoods. Again, welcome. Today we'll be using Zoom webinar function to host this conversation. You will be able to use the question and answer as well as the chat function throughout. Currently, we have two ways to interact on this meeting. It's the panelists, as you see myself and my colleagues are currently panelists, and if you're logged on, you're currently an attendee. In a couple minutes here, we will promote those who indicated they wanted to speak on behalf of their neighborhood as panelists, and you all will have the chance to speak on behalf of your neighborhood and ask us questions more directly throughout the presentation. And if you feel like your questions aren't being answered, then you have the opportunity to do that in the chat and the question and answer function. Please note that we have broken up this presentation into parts, and so we have time after each section to ask questions related to the section that we just covered. And so if you feel like your question isn't related to that section, and by the end of the presentation we have not yet covered a question by section, you can ask that question. However, please reserve questions that aren't directly related to sections covered until either after the section is covered or after the meeting in its entirety, as we will have time to address questions then. Again, welcome. My name is Najma Muhammad. I'm a city planner. With me, I have my colleagues, Anna Nanaski, our lead planner, and Matt Barnes, also a planner. The first thing we want to ask you today is how much you know about Infill. We're going to put up a brief poll to get those answers from you all. And so if you could just tell us how much at this time do you know about Infill? Is it a lot? Is it a little bit? You've read our proposed changes, or nothing at all, and that's cool too. We hope that by the end of the session today, you know a little bit more about it. Great. Alrighty, so it seems like we have a couple people who know enough to be dangerous, someone who knows a little bit, and quite a few of you who've actually read the proposed ordinance changes. So that's awesome. And for that person out there who knows nothing at all, I'm hoping by the end of this, you know enough to be dangerous. I'm going to share that with you guys just so you can see it. All right. That's so you know, I'm telling the truth, and by the end, you all will know enough to be dangerous. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Najma Muhammad. We have Anna Nanaski and Matt Barnes who's going to be helping me present today. And for those panelists who want to discuss on behalf of their neighborhood, you can assist us. We have your names, but you can also assist us by raising your hand if you feel like you don't remember whether or not you asked to be a participant as a panelist today.
Najma,
Yes,
Margaret Smith, and Ellen Haley, you need to accept the promotion, and Robert Martin, they have been promoted as panelists. Those are the neighborhood representatives that I see that are now panelists.
okay. If there's anyone else who's currently an attendee and do not see anyone on the attendees list or up as panelists who you think may be here in representation of your neighborhood, please feel free to raise your hand so that you can represent your neighborhood if you feel like that's needed throughout the presentation. And for those of you who have just been promoted, if you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself and the neighborhood that you are here on behalf of.
Hi, I can start. I'm Ellen Haley. I'm a resident of the West Side North neighborhood. And we have gotten together with a couple neighbors to review the ordinance, had some emails go back and forth, and we've collected a handful of questions from a few different neighborhood members that we were going to ask today.
Awesome, thank you.
If you don't mind, I'm going to turn my video off because I'm eating dinner.
Okay.
Robert, you're next.
Hi, Robert Martin. I'm the president of the Plaza Westport Neighborhood Association, and we've been talking about this for the last 2 weeks in our neighborhood. So we have a few people on the attending, and so I'm here to ask questions on behalf of us all. So thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Margaret, you're next.
Hi, I'm Margaret Smith with Westwood Park. And Anna, you said I needed to accept something. Did I? I'm not quite sure.
You're connected correctly. Don't worry about it.
Okay, great. So we've reviewed this and we've been working with you all, and we're interested in continuing to work with you all on it. Thanks.
And lastly, a Mike.
Mike, if you're speaking, you may be muted.
I apologize.
No.
Yeah, Mike Poston, and I am with the Westwood Park neighborhood along with Margaret, and I have really no questions right now.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and just get right into the presentation. And again, as I said, throughout, you all will have the opportunity to ask questions in regards to the sections that we cover. And at the end, you all will have the opportunity to ask questions about everything in totality, and hopefully we meet all the questions you have throughout the presentation. But if not, you will have the opportunity to ask questions largely at the end as well. Okay. So the purpose of the Infill residential ordinance is to amend Chapter 88 of our Kansas City Code of Ordinances, which is our zoning and development code. And there are two sections of this code that we're wanting to amend. It's the lot and building standards as well as the minor subdivision regulations. The amendments, if approved, would support the provisioning of potential new housing and reinvestments to existing housing stock in the city. And the goal of this ordinance is to achieve contextually appropriate residential development throughout the city on what we have deemed to be infill by our proposed definition or non-conforming lots. And so the first question when talking about development is, what is development? Development is the building, construction, renovation, maintenance of any building, be it a residential structure or even a commercial building. This is the division of land into parcels or any material change of a building. So this could be putting a new surface on your home, changing it from brick to vinyl, any of the sort. That's a small case, but it could be as large as the construction of a new subdivision or a new mall. And who are developers? Developers are individuals, corporations, and partnerships who manages, owns, and invests, maintains in property. So again, a developer can be a homeowner, it could be you, it could be a renter maintaining the property they live in. If you're maintaining the physical property, the land surrounding the property, you are in fact a developer. This can be the improving of any parcel of land, whether you own it or not. So development or developers aren't always these big commercial corporations. They're also first-time home buyers, homeowners, and renters alike. And so largely speaking, what is infill? Infill development is development on undeveloped lots surrounded by developed lots or existing structures. And it's the improvement of existing developed lots based on our definition. This picture here, you see a real life example of what infill can look like under our current conventional zoning and development code, and what it could potentially look like under our infill development standards based on building contextual to the buildings that are already existing, or the homes rather that are already existing on a particular block face. So what we're proposing isn't something that residents can't already do. This is a process that is possible, but oftentimes take much longer, anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, 9 to 12 months, depending on the extent of it. what is available to residents right now. If they aren't able to meet what is allowed by the zoning and development code, they have to go through one of our entitlement processes, which I'll explain a little bit more. This requires a pre-application meeting, and then it requires for them to apply for maybe a minor subdivision or a variance. Variances have to go before the Board of Zoning Adjustments, and they have the final determination of whether or not someone can build. And before the Board of Zoning Adjustments, you have to prove a hardship as to why you are unable to fit within the code. So for instance, if you're wanting to expand on your deck or the front of your home, and your home already sits within the setbacks required by our modern day zoning code, you would have to get a variance to do that, even though it isn't technically, we'll say, your fault that your home sits 18 feet into what the modern setback is, because it was built maybe 100 years ago. So if the Board of Zoning Adjustments deny your request, you can't build. However, if they approve your request, you can build within the confines of the variance requested. And if what you request does not include something you maybe want to do down the line or in the future, you'll have to go through this process all over again to get a variance to another addition possibly to your home, if that applies to you. And then after you go through all of that, if approved, you can go to permits. What we're proposing now is another set of lot and building standards that would allow more homes that are already built, as well as homes that are being built between pre-existing homes, to be able to exist without going through Board of Zoning Adjustment processes when unnecessary. And so this is the infill lot and building standards. What will be determined is, do you fit into our conventional standards? No. Do you fit into our infill lot and building standards? If so, your lot and building standards will be determined by what we are proposing, the infill lot and building standards. And then if you are able to meet those and build within those confines, you will go straight to permits. If you aren't able to meet those requirements, then you'll have to go through the conventional process I had just explained, the current process through the Board of Zoning Adjustments, administrative approval, depending on what the project is. And so when I talk about by right development versus entitlement process, by right is what you can build within the allowance of our zoning and development code right now without varying at all. Can you build with certain setbacks? Is your lot the appropriate width and area? Can you do that right now? Go straight to permits without having to go through an entitlement process. An entitlement process is where you have to receive permission to build maybe large projects or unique projects on a particular peculiar lot, or projects outside of the zoning and development code before a public hearing body. So that's the Board of Zoning Adjustments, that's the City Plan Commission, that's City Council. And again, these processes can take anywhere from 6 weeks to even a year, depending on the expanse of the project. And so when we say conforming versus non-conforming, conforming lots means that you or your lot meets all of the lot and building standards. This is whatever setback requirements are there, the lot width, the lot depth, the lot area, and the height. The property on the land does not exceed the limits of what our requirements are, and does not fall below them either, and do not require a variance. And so this is an example of some conforming lots in our city based on the zoning code R1.5 that they sit in. However, there are also non-conforming lots that fall outside of our conventional standards, what our conventional standards allow. And so they require variance to our lot and building standards per their zoning. And so these are examples of non-conforming lots with technically non-conforming homes. However, your lot being non-conforming does not mean that your lot is not buildable. You can still build on this lot, it just will require variances. And in order to maintain it potentially or expand upon it, in order to get permits, you may have to get a variance to do so if your lot is non-conforming, because you may trigger something in our system that says, okay, you're doing something new to this property, which means you have to follow the new requirements of our zoning and development code. And so, before we go any further into what this infill development residential ordinance is, I want to explain a little bit of what it isn't, so there isn't confusion. And so when we're going through questions, we can stay on track to what we are proposing through the infill residential development. Our goal is not to force people out of their homes by any means. If you have a non-conforming lot, that does not mean you're illegal or we're going to tear down your home or anything like that. Essentially, that just means that this infill development ordinance may impact you and may assist you in being able to maintain your home without going through certain barriers that entitlement processes, the time and the money it takes to go through them may present to you. It doesn't allow for development people can already do. It's not creating greater allowances or making it easier to build a home outside of our zoning and development code. No, we are still requiring people to build within the context of the neighborhood, and you still have to go through permits. You still have to do all of what we require right now. It's just a more streamlined process. It is not selling property to out-of-state developers. We can't control what people do with their property. If someone owns a property and wants to sell it, that's up to them. But in city planning and development, we control what people can do with their property, but we can't in terms of zoning and development and building. We can't control how they sell it and who they sell it to. It does not control the architectural design elements of a property. We can control how people build and how big, to what extent on the lot they can build, but we can't control the materials they use, how the property looks to the eye. And those design elements are currently outside of what we regulate through the zoning and development code. This ordinance does not regulate green space. So what we're proposing does not change any of our landscaping requirements for new development. It's still required, that's still required in other sections of our code. But this is not a direct impact on how we regulate green space in residential neighborhoods. This does not allow for zero lot line housing. I will get into more of how the ordinance is contextual in terms of what already exists on a block. So if your neighbors' homes have certain setbacks, then we're taking the average of that, or 75% of the average of those setbacks, and applying it to what can exist on our proposed definition of an infill lot. And it does not adopt an affordable housing ordinance. While these changes may impact the ability to promote this policy in the future, this does not have a direct impact on affordable housing, nor does city planning department city planning and development management division. We can't control how fast or who passes the affordable housing ordinance. That is outside of our purview as planners. And so with all of that, for this first section, do you all have any questions from what I discussed? And you don't have to have questions. We can move on and save questions for the next part too.
Najma, no one appears to be raising their hand, and none of the elected representatives from the neighborhood groups have spoken up.
Okay. So at this time, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Matt Barnes, and he's going to explain a little bit about how the minor subdivision ordinance ties into our infill residential development lot and building standards that we're proposing.
Good afternoon, everybody. So concurrently with this ordinance, we have a minor subdivision ordinance that is being proposed. Next slide, please. So first off, what is a subdivision? Think of subdividing land. It's how lots are made. That we have two different processes here. We have major subdivisions, which require city planning commission and city council approval. For these, you'll be thinking of larger neighborhoods that are being built currently. These are typically on the fringes of the town, such as up north or down south, way down. So that's the major subdivisions. Minor subdivisions, which we're working on the ordinance for, are administratively approved. For example, a lot split, a lot line adjustment, or a lot consolidation. Subdivisions can be combining or splitting land. Next slide. So what is the problem? The zoning and development code is unclear in several different ways when it comes to minor subdivisions. As summarized below, we have issue 1, which is conflating eligibility criteria with approval criteria. Issue 2 is it assumes that every subdivider is dividing land into new lots for the purposes of development. And issue number 3 is any subdivision involving 6 or more lots must be approved through the major subdivision process. Next slide. So here we have an example of a typical neighborhood within the established core. As you can see on the to the right of the street, there is a lot that has a pink line running down the middle. That lot has since been combined. The pink line is the original platted lines. Thank you. Right there. And then the exterior of it is the combined lot. We'll kind of go over a few more examples of these in a minute. But currently, the city approval by right, the solution that we're proposing is to remove the barriers of minor subdivisions by streamlining the process, which would be city approval by right when consolidating lots or reestablishing lot lines. So the pink line there would be reestablishing that lot line that has been previously approved. Next step is to organize subdivision types by a new naming convention and clarify eligibility versus approval criteria. And we'll kind of go over those subdivision types here on a future slide. And providing incentives for incremental developers and minor subdivision policies that complement infill development. Next slide. So these are the 4 different types of subdivisions, minor subdivisions that we're proposing. Type 1 would be no net increase in lots. So it'd be a combination where you take 2 lots next to each other and combine them into one larger lot. And lot line adjustment, where you take 2 lots and move the lot line that is in common with them one way or the other. So no increase in lots. Type 2 would be increase up to 5 lots. So you take a larger parcel and you can split it up to 5 different types, different lots. This would not allow for require any public improvements, as this is the current process. Type 3 is the new proposed type, which would be a net increase up to 20 lots. And this would require some public improvements. Type 4 would be a condominium plat. So think of a large building downtown where each level is owned by a different person or entity. And all in common, they have common elements which they all maintain. So here we go for the lots. Currently on the left is a lot that's been combined with this proposed. On the right, we could establish the originally approved lot lines shown in pink. And on the next slide, I believe we will see that in kind of ground view, where that house is on the right in the photo that we saw, and those are the lot lines that are previously platted. So this will allow for the reestablishment of those lots. And now we'll take any questions on that section that you guys may have.
Hi, yeah, we had a question from the West Side North group about the minor subdivision items. So first of all, you just went through the 4 types. So to be clear, on all types, including 3 and 4, is there any kind of city meeting, city review, or I guess moment for neighborhood intervention that any of those types would have?
No, so it's all done administratively. Currently, for including condominium plats, the type 3 would, and correct me if I'm wrong, Najma, would not have any kind of public engagement as it is.
Correct. So
that is
these,
frustrating.
the types that you mentioned, Matt, all of them are already happening. They're already allowed. We're simply rearranging them to make them clearer and adding a naming convention. So before we had a slightly different naming convention, and we're making it a little bit easier by naming it type 1, 2, 3, and 4. The one that is being amended is type 3 to allow for up to 20 lots, but in that allowance, there is also a requirement for public improvements. However, if for whatever reason, someone who is a subdivider is wanting to subdivide those lots and not provide public improvements, a deviation from that would require them to go before a public board. So they would have to go before City Plan Commission and City Council to get those deviations to from allowing them or from requiring them to do public improvements.
Okay, so the type 3 would only require, I guess, public intervention if they didn't provide the city improvements.
Correct.
Currently are they required to have that? Like they currently have to go through the BCA variance process, correct?
No, not necessarily. So for minor subdivisions, it's a little bit different. It's a administrative approval process, but for major subdivisions, they have to go through the City Plan Commission and City Council. And so prior to this amendment, which is of course still pending, there is an allowance of up to 5 lots, and then after that, you have to go before City Council and City Plan Commissions and City Council. And now we're extending that to 20 lots, and you'd have to go after 20 lots. You'd have to go before City Plan Commission and City Council under the major subdivision regulations.
Okay, I see. And then one other question we had just kind of concerning the purchase of multiple lots that maybe have, smaller dwellings on them already, and then combining them for larger multifamily developments. I think our understanding is still that within sort of zoning code, anything larger than a duplex would still require a variance, like to create single family lots, combine them and makes a development larger than a duplex, I think still requires a variance, correct?
It depends on the circumstance. If someone's doing a development plan or a project plan, they would have to go through, again, City Plan Commission and City Council. However, if they wanted to potentially combine lots, maybe at this time they could do so through that minor subdivision process of a lot combination in terms of the housing type. So outside of a duplex, a multi-unit home or a townhome and things like that, it's based on zoning. So if those things are allowed within that zoning district and they can meet the zoning and development codes, lot and building standards to allow for that type of housing, they do not need a variance. However, if they cannot meet the lot and building standards, then they may require a variance, or they may require some other form of plan that goes through City Plan Commission and City Council. If they require a variance, they would go before the Board of Zoning Adjustments, correct? But that's only if they're unable to meet the lot and building standards. And that's based on the zoning as well as the residential building type, which has restrictions. And I can show those later if we want to go through those.
Okay, yeah, I think I got all of that. You're very knowledgeable. Okay, that sounds, so yeah, I think our understanding is still that if it's zoned for a single family dwelling, it can't be, being rezoned would be a totally sort of different process.
Exactly. Rezoning, of course, goes through City Plan Commission and City Council, and it's a whole new process.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Was there any other questions? Margaret, I saw you had your hand raised earlier.
Thank you. It took me a few minutes to find my unmute. So is the combining of the lots, is there a procedure to go through to combine those, or is it just because one person owns 2 or 3 consecutive lots when you showed those combined lots?
So there's, that's a good question. There's a couple answers to it. So in order to combine lots, is that your question? How can people combine lots? Or
yeah, I mean, you had the pink line that was showed where they used to be 2 different lots, and then the purple outline was what they were. How those 2 pink lines go away? How do they officially combine those lots?
Okay, yeah. So there's a couple ways that can happen. That can happen on a county level under common ownership if there is not a process you have to go through city staff, or it can happen through again a minor subdivision process and a lot consolidation,
Okay.
and they would have to be under common ownership. So, and for this particular property, I can't say for sure how these lots were combined, but it may happen over time through deed of plat, and so they were able to combine the lots. And what we're suggesting is that if you can prove where, and by prove I mean if a survey shows that the previously platted lot lines are here and you're wanting to establish exactly as they were the previously platted lot lines, you can do so by right instead of going through our minor subdivision process, because these lines were once approved by staff in the past.
Okay, so when you all show us the parcel viewer plan again with the combined lots or the red outlines for the lots, are those all officially combined lots, or are those all lots that just have the same property owner that are adjacent?
So I'll get into that more a little bit later in the presentation. Yeah, it'll be more clear for everyone so that they know exactly what we're talking about. But yeah. I'll explain that later. That's a different kind of lot combination by way of how our code was written in one of the sections. So I'll explain that more. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. And so when we're reestablishing previously platted lot lines, as well as addressing a lot of the non-conforming residential lots we have in the city, it requires a different kind of lot and building standard that will allow for contextual residential development to occur and allow for there to be fewer numbers of variants or other barriers to development that may occur for, again, homeowners, renters, people who want to improve on their home and they are already on a non-conforming lot that would require them to go before the Board of Zoning Adjustments. So what we're proposing are lot and building standards that would relieve some of those barriers and relieve some of that pressure of having to fit into our conventional zoning and development code that's really blanketed across the city and works, you know, when you're creating a whole lot of new lots, but less so when there are a lot of lots that are pre-existing prior to zoning that don't fit into our current zoning and development code and now have to try to fit into the zoning and development code. So what we're attempting to do is to relieve some of that inequity in terms of how our zoning and development code applies to lots across the city. Our data shows, and what you see on the map to your right here is that there are approximately 23,000 residential non-conforming lots across the city. So this is a citywide thing. It's not just concentrated in one singular area, although we clearly see that there is a concentration here. In terms of non-conforming lots, there are several areas where this exists across the city. And so the lot and building standards we currently have are conventional, open space, and conservation. And we're proposing a fourth type, which is infill development. If you've ever looked in our zoning and development code, you'll look at our lot and building standards and you see all of our zones across the top, and our setback requirements are lot width, minimum lot set width and length, depth, and rear, front, side setback requirements. You'll see those laid out in the table and you see all these numbers. And so we're doing that and adding a fourth one that's a little bit more clear and a little bit more contextual to, or a lot more contextual to the lots that are already existing as opposed to those that are being newly created. And so for a second, we're going to look at the parcel map that Margaret was just referring to. So I'm not sure if you can see it yet. Let me know.
It's up, Najma.
Awesome. Okay. So the parcel map here shows what I have up now is our layer for the neighborhood, so you all can see the different neighborhoods outlined. But if we zoom in a little bit more, we are going to see purple lots, we're going to see some orange lots, and we're going to see some red lines. And the red lines is what Ms. Margaret was referring to earlier. And so our purple lots are non-conforming lots. And again, those non-conforming lots mean that these lots, for whatever reason, do not fit into the lot and building standards required by the respective zoning code that the lots are currently in. The orange lots are vacant lots. And if they are pinkish, that means they are vacant and non-conforming, and potentially means that they're vacant, non-conforming, and considered infill. The red lines around the lots, per a section of our code that I'll get into a little bit more in a bit here, we say that if there are non-conforming lots abutting one another under common ownership, they are thus deemed combined. And you cannot, under any circumstance, separate these lots if the separation of those lots will create greater nonconformity. And so technically, if you were to separate all four of these nonconforming lots to create the lots that are contextual to what is surrounding them, they would create nonconformity, greater nonconformity, because they're all nonconforming lots. However, if you were to, under our proposed ordinance, separate these lots, these wouldn't be deemed nonconforming if in fact the infill development standards applied to these lots were into the context of what's applied to the rest of the lots on this block face. Again, I'll go into that a little bit more, but just so you have an idea of what we're going to be getting into here. And so again, the solution to the overwhelming number of infill development lots that we're proposing is to create lot and building standards that meets the needs of not only the reestablished lots that are typically smaller in the context of what the neighborhood was, how the neighborhood was previously built and what the surrounding houses are typically adhering to, as well as those lots that are already existing in these smaller non-conforming lots that are not fitting into the zoning that is currently there. This happens through rezoning on a neighborhood level, down zoning, wanting to avoid apartments coming in to the neighborhood, but thus creating non-conforming lots for all of the homes that already exist there, because none of the lots fit into the new zoning requirements. This can be because the lots were platted and built upon prior to zoning existing, and a myriad of other reasons. And so we're attempting to remove some of the barriers to, again, small developers and or homeowners, renters who are seeking to improve on their existing lot. And we're also trying to invest in what already exists in terms of city infrastructure for creating lots or building on lots that already have access or links to our water and sewer system, so on and so forth. And again, legalizing lots that again are buildable but are deemed non-conforming based on our conventional lot and building standards, and would take a variance process or a development plan or something of the sort to be able to build on it in a way that is contextual to the environment, or to the environment in terms of the homes that are surrounding it, but is not allowed under our current code. And so these are just some examples of different infill housing types that would potentially fit into what we are suggesting. However, again, we want to reiterate and we want to make sure this is very, very clear. The residential housing types that we are allowing aren't changing. As of right now, any home type in terms of single family home, duplex, or single unit home, duplex, multi-unit home, these are still regulated under that portion of our code. It is not allowing for apartments to be built in an R6 district simply because an infill lot is there. We are still regulating the types of housing so that they are contextually appropriate to the residential building types that are already there and the residential building types that are already allowed for. And so in terms of what we are wanting to put into the code for our definitions for residential infill development is two definitions. The infill residential development is defined as any residential development, whether existing, new construction, or modification to an existing residential structure on an infill residential lot. Infill residential lot is any lot zoned residentially and meeting one or more of the following criteria. This is described by deed or plat recorded prior to January 1st, 1954, or annexed into the corporate limits of Kansas City prior to January 1st, 1954. And so this is an example of Blue Hills, which is one of our, we've determined through our data collection that this is one of the most impacted neighborhoods in the city. A majority of their lots are non-conforming, and they have a higher volume of both non-conforming and vacant lots. And so this is a situation where someone, under our proposed ordinance, someone would have to come in and build to the context of the homes that already exist on this lot, on these lots here. And this again is an example of an area where these lots would no longer be deemed combined because they would no longer be considered non-conforming under our infill development standards here, at least. These still might be because the lots here are a little bit bigger, but on this block face, these may not be considered combined under our infill residential development ordinance. These are some examples of the non-conforming and potential infill lots on the west side, based on our map that I showed you before. These are some in Volker. This is an aerial view of Volker in its entirety and a little bit of a zoomed in view as well. Same for the last slide. These are some in Westwood Park. These are some in Plaza Westport. And again, for those lots with homes already on them and they're non-conforming, the way that this ordinance would impact you is if you're wanting to either expand or do anything on your home that would trigger the need for a variance or something that is outside of what is allowed under our current lot and building standards because of the size of the lot and the placement of the home on the lot. This could be an expansion into the rear yard, an expansion into the front or side yards, or the removal and replacement of a pre-existing portion of the home. But if you remove it, permits requires you to get a variance if it sits into a setback. However, that may not be necessary if lot and building standards under the proposed infill development standards suggest that the setbacks you have are in line with the surrounding properties, and thus you would be allowed to do what it is you're proposing. And again, this is going to be case by case, but that's largely how it could potentially impact homes with lots with homes already existing on them. And so part of what this ordinance is wanting to discourage is large homes across multiple lots, similar to this, where most of the homes on the block are on individual lots, where this home combined 3 lots to be created. And so this is just an example of something that the infill development ordinance would be able to curb according to the required lot and building standards. And so what it is trying to encourage is more contextual homes, building in the character of what's already there in terms of building height, again, setbacks, front and rear, in interior side as well as street yard setback requirements, and even so much as the allowances for driveways and garages. And so we've heard those different concerns as we've worked through this ordinance, and we've tried to apply them to continue to make this ordinance as contextual as possible and allow for flexibility, but also allow for some restrictions. And so here are some of the other standards outside of the lot and building standards for setbacks and lot area and all of that are also being applied to the infill development ordinance in terms of where detached garages can be located, if garages or drive pads are allowed based on the status of other homes on that block, as well as what happens when there are 2 or fewer developed lots on a block. And so with that, are there any questions?
Margaret raised her hand first, so I think she should speak up next.
Well, my first question is, can you just tell us the significance of the 1954 date and the definition of infill residential lot?
Good question.
January 1st, 1954 date, significance of that. That's when.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
That corresponds with a major amendment or adoption of the zoning code in relation to Kansas City, Missouri.
And is this so are you going to go into more detail about the setbacks necessarily and show us an example? I liked seeing how your most recent or past slide or two about how you're trying to prevent buying three small lots to put one larger house on. Are you going to go through and show a similar example for setbacks and then side or rear setbacks, or explain further about the floor area ratio and how that's going to help restrict height limits?
There are so many different zoning districts, and the regulations are contextual in nature. We don't have time to go through each possibility tonight, but I think Najma, at the end of the presentation, you can show where people can find all of the lot and building standards so they can get an idea of what are some of the requirements that we currently have in the city. But I just don't think we have enough time to go through each example of, it could be 5 feet over here, it could be 10 feet over
Well,
here.
and I'm not asking for something like that. I'm just saying like a prototypical case study that shows, if you have the 100-foot, you have one property and the 100-foot circumference or arc around it, affected property. How are you just it's sort of like a prototype or an example just to show how that works to help establish the setback for the infill project as opposed to the current setbacks for an R6 or an another zoned property. And maybe that's maybe it's not possible to do a prototype, but then that leads to the question of, since everything is so, how difficult will it be to monitor and implement these criteria that are supposed to take the neighborhood and context into effect? And I'll turn my mute on again for a few minutes.
So in terms of difficulty, that's what we're here for. We're here to do the measurements of the surrounding properties and generate those lot and building standards based on what we are providing by code in our proposed amendment. And so we have a calculator to generate those measurements. How we find those measurements is through our systems, our parcel viewer systems, Jackson County's parcel viewer systems, and we do those measurements through a calculator that we have internally. So at this time, we don't have a public calculator. It would be great for us to have one, but that may take some time to create for the larger public to simulate different lot and building standards for each lot. But at this time, I can tell you that the calculator we do have is effective. And through generating maybe 12 different houses and taking based on what the code is suggesting, 75% of the average area of a lot, or the average width of a lot, or front and rear yard setbacks and all of that, it does present numbers that again are comparable to the surrounding properties, not exceeding them in great expanse and not going below them. And so we're not allowing for anything that is outside of the scope of the neighborhood. And I don't know if that's enough information or clear, but
well, it just seems like it would be helpful to see one prototype, not that to apply to everything, but just be helpful to see one.
So what I showed you before was a real life example, and I can go back to that slide. Give me a moment here.
Sure, thanks. And then another question kind of related to that is, what happens when lots don't actually align with legal descriptions? Because I know that the legal description for my property says something like lot 70 plus the 10 feet east of lot 69, or the west, whatever it is, the 10 more feet of lot 69. How does that work with the lots shown on the parcel viewer?
So it depends on what you mean. I'm not sure I'm very clear. It may sound like you need a lot line adjustment, Matt. Is that?
No, so
Description.
it seems like at one point in time, your lots were adjusted or combined with, the 10 feet of lot that is adjacent to your property.
Mhm.
This minor subdivision ordinance would not allow for, it only allows for the reestablishing of previously platted lot lines. So any variant from that. So if the legal descriptions are not, for instance, lot 1, 2, and 3 of John Doe's subdivision, then you would not be eligible. It's only for the reestablishment of the lines.
No, the question is, with the calculator, your parcel viewer shows the lots, right? They don't show.
They show the existing parcels and lot. So we are seeing the blue lines that we see on parcel viewer are what exists today, not what was previously platted.
So they should align with the legal description of the property.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Ellen, you're next.
Great. So our question on this is kind of pertaining to narrower lots that are now getting adjusted for what their side setback requirements are, and especially when there's an existing structure really close to the lot line on there. So I guess we're curious, are there any considerations or provisions for, I guess, like if you're building a new structure that now has a really tight lot line because of sort of the new calculations that could end up being really, really close to an existing house that has windows, against the existing property line, like a minimum distance between two structures that's outside of the setback from the property line or something like that. Just kind of thinking about these smaller lots that the side setback could get pretty minimal and could kind of affect sort of just natural light and things that are next to the neighbor's windows if it gets really, really close. That makes sense?
Yes. So this ordinance purely affects lot and building standards. There are still building code requirements that are applicable to all construction, and items like firewall protection or ventilation for windows will be addressed during that phase of the process. And those things are considered in regards to the context of the neighborhood as well. So if building permits reviewer is looking at a site plan and there's a building permit associated with it, and they can see, ooh, this home is very close to the other home, they might require a certain fire protection rating due to its contextual nature. That's about as much as I know about it, because I'm not a building permits reviewer and I don't have the building code memorized, but those items will be considered at that process of development.
So I guess maybe the consideration more on the existing house that is really close to this new proposed development that does have windows facing, against a property line, facing this other property. Will there be, I know the new house is going to have a fire rating and, might not be allowed to have windows within a certain square footage, but if that person's able to build their house, a foot or so away from the windows of another person's house, is there any consideration between building a new structure next to an existing one and a minimum distance just between those existing buildings?
Can you repeat the last part of that question? Is there any consideration for building a new structure next to an existing one and
building a new structure next to an existing one with, I guess in the scenario of like a zero lot line new construction, building like only a foot or something like that off of an existing building that has windows in it. And now there's a new constructed building that maybe is following current fire codes, doesn't have windows, has a rated wall on that side, but is now just a foot from the neighbor's house that does have windows in it. And not from a fire code perspective, but just kind of a livability perspective from that house that had been existing there. a provision in addition to the setback calculation that also says, there needs to be 2.5, 3 feet between against any existing structure.
And how we're addressing that is through the context of the side yard requirements. And so at this time, it is solely based on the existing side yard setbacks on a block face. And so that requirement is taking 10% of the lot width, or 50% of the average side yard setback on the block face, and whichever is greater. And so we're trying to mitigate super small lots by adding that provision in of whatever is greater, because sometimes even if the block face or the average side yard setback is very small, the lot width itself may require for greater separation. And so that's the main way that we're trying to mitigate that. But again, as Anna said, a lot of that comes through the building code process.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Robert, you're next.
Hi. So thanks a lot. I really appreciate the intention of this new ordinance change. I think it's really great. We are very concerned about the unintended consequences. That is, what can get through the planning process more easily, can slip through without the neighborhood knowing. So there are several questions I posed by email, but let me try to get, I guess, to the nub of some of them. If I understand, so we have in the Plaza Westport, north of the Plaza Westport neighborhood, we have 2 very large apartment complexes between Washington and Pennsylvania. And then we have single family residences between those. On the Washington side, they are zoned for R1.5. And on the Pennsylvania side, they are R6. And so if I understand you correctly, if they're going to combine 1.5 lots, then the single family houses on 1.5 can be demolished, and a multifamily structure of 20 or less units can be built, and the neighborhood would not be notified, and the neighborhood would have no input into that. Is that true?
That is correct, and that can happen right now.
Exactly. That's right. But what about the R6? So it's the zoning that prevents that scenario from happening on the other side of the street.
Correct. The R6 prohibits the multi-family building type from being established.
Okay, and any attempt to rezone the property then kicks in the regular notification process and public engagement.
That is correct.
Okay, great. The next thing is so even on the 1.5 zoning, well, let me ask the question that we asked here. What weight is given by city planning administration to existing neighborhood plans or area plans? That is, when you're deciding, when you have an administrative decision to make, how is the plan taken into consideration, and how is the neighborhood commitments, like Plaza Westport has committed and talked with our city council representatives that we cannot afford to lose any more single family dwellings? So is there any consideration given at when you're trying to approve this infill plan?
Are you talking about for a site-by-site, on a site-by-site basis, or overall us considering this particular ordinance?
Considering this particular ordinance, if for example, these, I'm looking at them out of my window. So the two huge apartment complexes are 5 stories tall, and the R, and in between that is R 1.5. The question is, can the new development go up 5 stories with 20 units, and but the area plan for that site stipulates 45 feet, right? So what's the weight given to the area plan when you're approving an infill development?
Okay, so I'll approach this from 2 directions. The infill development ordinance as a whole, we perceive that as implementing area plans. So for example, the Midtown Plaza area plan talks a lot about infill development, about how it needs to be contextual in nature, and that is precisely the goal of this ordinance. Now, when you whittle down to it to a review case-by-case basis, if
Right.
someone comes in and they have a proposal, they have a building permit, it's being administratively approved or reviewed through an entitlement process. If they are legally meeting our code, our requirements, they deserve due process. They go through the system. Just because they are maybe the 5th person on that block to do that type of construction type, we are not legally allowed to prohibit them from doing what they want on their property, regardless of what the area plan says.
Okay. Just one more question, and that is, is there a way to incorporate a time limit between destruction of something in order to build, and is there a way to build in to allow for a minimum time period between destruction, deconstruction, and construction? Because right now we have several lots that are empty, they have holes in them, they're unsafe, they got, water gets in them, and they're safety hazards, and they're just ugly.
Yeah, understood. So those are details that would need to be addressed through a demolition ordinance. And more specifically, if you are in particularly having issues with sites near your neighborhood, those need to be brought up with the building permits division, because there could be some conditions related to their demolition permit that have not been satisfied. And if there's health and safety issues, that department needs to be aware, so then violations can be addressed.
Okay, so you wouldn't want to incorporate those kinds of, you're saying there's no need to incorporate those kinds of restrictions or guidelines or whatever
For this particular ordinance,
because
no, it's
they're
not
elsewhere.
appropriate.
Okay.
That is a separate issue that specifically involves demolition.
Got it.
The two really can't be crossed at this time. It
Okay,
would get messy
great.
for reviewers.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, Nashma, I think we can move on to the conclusion.
Okay. So I talked a little bit about what this ordinance is not, but now I want to close in what this ordinance is. So this ordinance is moving toward helping other departments and City Hall and other organizations throughout the city work toward more accessible and affordable housing options, as well as accessible and affordable housing policies. We're hoping that this can support those desires or those commitments to affordable housing by providing more accessible and buildable lots, by creating them, by making them legal or conforming. We are creating fewer barriers or reducing the number of barriers for first time and incremental developers. Again, developers can be home buyers, it can be renters, people who are simply trying to maintain their homes or maintain properties that they own. It's not always big corporations coming into the city or out-of-state people. It's going to be your neighbor who just wants to build on or expand their home, and they can't do so without going through our processes that take time and money, and they discourage them from doing any maintenance on their home altogether. And this is streamlining processes for homeowners. This is allowing people who already own homes on non-conforming lots to go forward and again maintain what they have, and we're also making use of the existing land and existing infrastructure. So on these lots that we're deeming infill, especially those in the urban core, we are looking at lots that already have access to public infrastructure, to public water, sidewalks, sewer, etc. And again, taking care of what we already have as cities, taking care of what property owners already have. We are wanting to improve on that and invest in that through different policy changes in zoning and development code. And so this is what Development Management Division can do right now. We don't want to stay complacent and allow this problem to be exacerbated by not making any forward motion. And we do realize that there's a lot that we have to do as planners in order to break down some of the historical inequities that were brought upon the city's residents through planning. So it is our job to undo that through policies that allows for equitable access to land, equitable access to development, and so on. And so you've met us. You've met our community partners. Thank you all so much for joining us. You understand our limitations in this ordinance, but you also understand how much we can do and how much we are wanting to help support and move forward with this issue moving forward. Next steps, we still have community meetings to host similar to this. We have 2 more in the next 2 Thursdays on the 28th, as well as May 5th. And we'll be engaging more as people ask us questions, and we still have our Chapter 88 website that is constantly being updated. If you all have questions, again, you have our information. You can use the interest form on that website or our email addresses. And then after that, we're wanting to take this through City Plan Commission, and ultimately City Council will have the final say. And so at this time for the question and answers portion, there's not that many of us, but still we want to maintain the 1 speaker at a time and listening to all the questions being asked so that we can avoid redundancy and making sure that, okay, they asked that question, but maybe my answers and the staff's answers to their question. And so again, being respectful of other panelists, including city staff, as well as other neighborhood members who wish to speak and ask questions as well. And so now is the time to ask any and all questions that were not addressed in our presentation, or that you're still like, what is going on? I do not know enough to be dangerous about infill development. I'm missing something. Najma, help me now. So now's the time to ask questions.
Najma, I'm going to promote a Christina. And then Margaret, you'll be next after that. Christina, you have been connected. You can ask your question.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I apologize, I'm late, and I'm sure this was probably already addressed with Robert, and I did get on the tail end of the question he had for West Plaza, or not West Plaza, Plaza Westport neighborhood on Washington, where they built the apartments, and I know he went over that, but I just had a quick question that on that land that the apartments were built at 44th and Washington, basically, and then extended to the south down Washington. I was just a little confused because the zoning, is there a possibility that they changed that zoning because they took down 6 bungalows, and it was bungalows all the way down that street. And, I don't understand how on I live directly behind that. So now I've got apartment buildings peering into my kitchen and balconies when I had bungalows next to me before. So it's like, I've been surrounded now by multi-family, but I just don't understand how Washington, I can see Warnell or Broadway on a more broad street where there's, St. Luke's and all of that, but was the zoning, I mean, is that something that they changed or somehow they changed? I don't understand why it would be different when it was all bungalows there before and all of a sudden we have this. I don't see how it happened is what I guess I'm saying. And
Yeah,
with
and
the 45, yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Christina, I just threw my email in the chat. We can take this discussion online since
Sure.
it's a very specific question related to the existing conditions of your neighborhood.
Sure.
I'm fairly familiar with that project in that area. So if you could reach out to me tomorrow morning and
Okay.
I can follow up on exactly what occurred on those sites.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. Margaret?
Thank you. So could you just please walk through a process where someone submits for a building permit in one of our single family residential neighborhoods, R6 neighborhoods, for an infill lot? What's the procedure for the review process and at the city to try to make sure that it is a contextually appropriate project, both in size, in footprint, and vertically?
Okay. So what will happen is they'll submit an application for a permit through Compass KC. That permit will be routed to likely me if this is the very first one, and we will put the measurements in our infill residential or infill lot and building standards calculator. We will put those up against the requirements proposed in our ordinance for the lot and building standards. And we have a calculator essentially that generates what those requirements are. We would do that for all the homes on that block face, and then it would result in measurements requirements for the minimum lot area, as well as the building height. The height will already be determined. That's a static number, but it'll determine the floor area ratio that I know we've had questions about before, Margaret, so I can go into that a little bit more, as well as side yard setbacks, rear, front, etc. We would return those measurements back to the applicant, and they would have to make sure that what they're wanting to build fits into those requirements. If they're wanting to go outside of those requirements, they would again have to go through our current process of scheduling a pre-application meeting and going before the Board of Zoning Adjustments to receive variances to the code.
And how do your calculator
So
the floor area ratio of adjacent properties?
So we receive our floor area ratio measurements through, we have access to other counties' floor area ratios, and they have already determined that number. So for those of you who aren't familiar with a floor area ratio, it is the lot size, the lot size up against the building footprint, so the size of the building, but the size of the building is also based on the number of floors in that building, and that calculation has already been determined by counties like Jackson County. So we take that number and we take the average floor area ratio. The floor area ratio determines how many floors, the maximum number of floors, as well as height a building can be. So you can go either as wide or as high as a certain floor area ratio allows for it, and that's how we determine all buildings in the city as of right now, with of course still having a height maximum. So if you reach your floor area ratio maximum or ceiling before you reach the height maximum, that's your required height. If you are able to hit the max height requirement without exceeding your floor area ratio, then you could also do that. I don't know if that's clear. It's kind of difficult to explain without having a picture, but
well, Well, I appreciate more of that explanation because I didn't really realize. So are these like what they use for assessing property tax and stuff, or is it assessors? Is that where you're getting? I just don't know how this information.
You're wanting to know exactly where the information
just in
is coming
general,
from and how it's generated, or?
Yeah, is it from, I mean, is this what they're basing your tax assessments on or something? Is that the kind of information that you're using or something? You don't really know where it comes
speak
from.
to that part.
Okay.
I'm just speaking to the information or the data we get from the county. A lot of the parcel viewer from our Kansas City, Missouri parcel viewer comes from the county information. And so we update that from what we know, and we regularly update that on from what the county has given us access to as well. And so in terms of tax assessments and things like that, that's more of a county question and how they use their data, but how we're using their data is to determine floor area ratios and potential lot size changes and things like that that we have yet to capture, but generally we're on top of things.
Okay, well, thank you for that additional explanation.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we're approaching 7:30. I think we're going to end this meeting. We'll take one more question because city staff we're approaching a 12-hour workday right now. But I understand that lots of people might have more questions. Everyone has Najma's contact information. My email is in the chat. If further questions need to be addressed after tonight, when you've had maybe some more time to process the information, we can do that. So Robert, you'll conclude our question and answer, and then we will end the meeting.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much again. And so this might be a really appropriate question to end on, because I'm going to ask about accountability. How do you make sure that the permission that you give is completed the way that you have meant it to be completed, right? So how do you hold people accountable to do what you had given them permissions to?
Do you mean by way of permits? So after you make the determinations of the measurements, how do we know they're building accordingly?
Right. Is it the same process by which other permits are held accountable, are
in terms of
reviewed
inspections?
and held accountable?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so the inspection process is not subverted or abbreviated. Got it. Okay.
People are still held to the same standards for public health and safety. Again, not trying to make it easier for people to get around the law, just making it easier to go through our processes. Things, again, people can already do. You just want them to be able to do them with less barriers.
Super. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. And so thank you so much for participating. Thank you so much for agreeing to be panelists. I know being a panelist can be a little bit nerve-wracking. We do it often in public hearings. And so thank you all for participating on behalf of your neighborhoods. And it seems like you didn't make any of your neighborhood people angry. So that's good. You did a good job of representing them and asking questions on their behalf. We appreciate you all coming out. This was just recorded. Jesus, this is etched in stone now, but this is recorded live on YouTube. So even that little clip I just had, you'll be able to see in the future and share it with anyone who wasn't able to make the meeting or who is wanting more information. You all have a great evening. And yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed your dinner.
Thank you.
Y'all